Explore it could be.
She's never know with her. Yeah, at the back one, right?
At the west. It's sort of like in an apartment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, just over there.
That's nice.
Yeah,
Yes, I have
it's
read
nice.
it, but
It's over there.
Yeah, Marie-Pierre's Jake,
Somewhere.
she's jealous. She's
Yeah.
you know, why do we get a nice apartment? And
But also,
Ben, je pense que ça veut dire comme qu'il y a la voile. Parce que les personnes à la clé, ça doit être les psychanalystes aussi. Dans le
Mais c'est qui qui a
contexte.
écrit ça?
Deligny? Tu connais Deligny? Ben, tu sauras.
We're going to get ourselves going. I'm Ian Bach, I'm the director of the FHI, and it is lovely to welcome you all, and particularly to welcome Erin Manning and Brian Massumi, who are beginning a week-long residency with us. This is already the second event of the residency in sort of standard two tradition. We're asking both Erin and Brian to do an enormous amount of work. But it's delightful to have you here. In addition to this afternoon's talk, Erin and Brian will be convening a seminar that begins tomorrow noon, in the FHI. There'll be a second session of that on Friday. Brian will be lecturing on Thursday. And there was a roundtable conversation this afternoon that was co-organized by the FHI and the Neurohumanities Group and the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences with Ralph Severesi, who's visiting from Brunel. So we're looking forward to this as the second in a series of really rich conversations. We're just delighted, absolutely thrilled that you're joining us. So thanks so much. I'm actually going to turn the podium over now to my colleague, Tommy DeFrance, from the dance department to offer a proper introduction to Erin. Thanks.
So it's a pleasure to be able to introduce you and actually stand in front of you for a minute. I'm thrilled to be part of the home team. I just got to Duke last year. And I want to start with just a little anecdote so that gives some context for my excitement and enthusiasm, which I do have today. 2 years ago, I was putting together a group of researchers for an event at PSI, Performance Studies International. We were meeting in Utrecht, and this is an ongoing project I call Choreography. And we read texts and create a structured improvisation and create performances based on material we're looking at. And I gathered a group of collaborators from London, from California, and from the East Coast as well. And one day, this is a true story, we've been working for about a month, and one of the collaborators from London said, "Oh, I'm reading this book, we need to use this book. This text is amazing." And the collaborator from California said, "I'm reading a new book too." This is a true story here. And I had just gotten in the mail, maybe a week before, Relationscapes, your book, Relationscapes. And I said, "Oh, I'm reading this text as well, maybe we should think about this." So Relationscapes became one of the primary texts we looked at for this work on choreography, we dance theory. And I tell that anecdote to kind of express how unavoidable Erin's work is, as we're thinking about sort of performance studies, corporeality, dance studies, these areas that are of huge interest to me. And I think in terms of how we imagine movement, social movement, individual movement, the place of art within kind of thinking about movement. So Erin Manning is a philosopher, visual artist, and dancer, and is currently University Research Chair at the Faculty of Fine Arts Concordia in Montreal. She's founder and director of the Sense Lab, an interdisciplinary laboratory on research creation, and an international network focusing on intersections between philosophy and art through the sensing body in motion. She received her Ph.D. in political science at the University of Hawaii, and has been teaching philosophy, political theory, visual studies, cultural studies, and film theory. She's a member of the editorial board for the online journal Inflexions, and the author of works on movement and ephemerality, including Relationscapes, movement, art, philosophy, and politics of touch, sense, movement, sovereignty. She has 2 forthcoming books, Always More Than One, Individuations Dance, and Thought in the Act, Passage in the Ecology of Experience. So please let's welcome Erin Manning.
It's always amazing to me that people read the work that you write. Isn't that the weirdest thing? You sit in this room and you think that, you know, it stops making sense to you and you find out these people actually pick it up. It's amazing. So it's a real pleasure to be here. There are many people in this room who have contributed to this thinking. You'll recognize yourselves. I don't always quote you. In fact, when I was writing the preface to this new book, that this piece is from I realized that my practice really was a practice of thinking with rather than of quoting. Perhaps that's partly my influence of having worked in the essayistic French tradition. And perhaps it's a bit of a frustration with this academic imposed practice of always parenthetically assigning your groups. Sometimes I feel that maybe there are other ways of thinking with than putting people in parentheses. What I'm going to give today is a piece that is a later chapter in the book that's coming out in January from Duke called Always More Than One. And it's, what I realized when I finished it was that I'd actually written a trilogy by accident. So it's a continuation of Relationscapes, Politics of Touch, Relationscapes, Always More Than One, which I'm hoping closes the window a little bit so I can get back to full-time dancing and art, finding it, as usual, very difficult to manage all of them. The only thing that I want to say about this piece before I begin is that throughout the book, I develop a concept of speciation, which comes up sort of suddenly because this is chapter 8 in a long book. And so I won't go into a lot of detail. We can discuss it if it's an interesting concept afterwards. But I'll just say that what I'm trying to do throughout the book is to come up with a concept of the more than human, which is speciation would include the human, but definitely not be limited by the human. And so it's not the term that we find in Darwin, for example, where speciation, I'm developing it differently. The shape of enthusiasm. I'm going to begin with a poem called Our Voice by Jim Sinclair. Auti speak. This is the language we speak, we who can talk without sound. This is our voice in the silence, where every word has weight and no thought is ever lost. This is the language we speak, we who embrace without touching. This is our dance without bodies, where every touch has meaning and no glance is ever wasted. This is the language we speak, we who can see without looking. This is our star behind darkness, where velvet rainbows sing and no tears fall unseen. This is the language we speak, we who can float outside time. This is our home beyond nowhere, where shadows' footsteps fall, where memory echoes from the future and comfort flows back from the past, where smiles have no need for faces and warmth breathes from the frozen places. This is our source, our destination, where every song is heard and no soul shines unknown. This is our dance without bodies, where every touch has meaning and no glance is ever wasted. This is the language we speak. This is the language we speak, a language between the sounding of words, a language in the shaping for, quote, we who can float outside time. This is the language we speak, a language beyond communication, a language that shapes a different kind of coming together, a different kind of being heard. This is the language we speak, Auti speak. But it is also the language we speak, any speak, a language that spreads across the telling and marks the underneath of wording, a language that is mute and sounding of expressions in the shaping, of becoming's with in the pre of articulation. This is the language we speak, written before the words, between the lines, with and across expression and expressibility, where smiles have no need for faces and warmth breathes from frozen places. Not of syllables, but of shapes. The language is within language before language, that is a field of resonance, an intensive enjoyment of an enthusiasm with and in the world, that speaks not in the name of I, but in the interval where the many become one and are increased by one. This is our voice in the silence, where every word has weight and no thought is ever lost. This is a language we hear in Auti type, by those whose typing makes felt how the relational is everywhere active in the writing. I should say here, Auti type is a concept that comes from Ralph, which refers to autistics on the classical side of the spectrum who come to language rather late usually, and do it through often through facilitated communication, which means that they're facilitated and they're in their activation for the typing, sometimes with a touch on their elbow, sometimes on their shoulder, sometimes just by the presence in the room, in Ralph's son's case, with the holding of a pencil. And what is specific about autistic writing in this category is that they come to language in this sort of direct relationship to poetry. And I've discussed this in earlier chapters in the book, and so you're coming late to the concept, but that's what I'm talking about in terms of Auti-type. This is a language we hear in Auti-type by those whose typing makes felt how the relational is everywhere active in the writing, a language we can also become attuned to in the complex fieldings of choreographic thinking. I've described earlier in the book as well choreographic thinking not so much as a modality of organizing bodies for dance, but as an attunement to how complex relational environments are crafted. So we could talk about choreographic thinking in terms very separate from dance, but of course it's a vocabulary and a modality of organization that comes from dance. In the dance of attention, in architectings of mobility that create propositions for an ecology of participation that exceeds what we thought movement could do. This language we never quite speak, but are always tuning towards, is a language with weight, heavy with not yet soundings, a language which vibrates in a suspense of the inact, but which acts nonetheless, intensively shaping a worlding that redefines the very core of what we understand as activity. Activist philosophy, from Brian, the inact of worldings yet to come in the tremulous ecological resonance of the elastic almost, where movement moves and life lives. This intensity, an intensity of the withness of expressibility, activates a process, I want to suggest, that takes the shape of enthusiasm, a kind of Spinoza's joy of the betweenness of experience, an enthusiasm with life in the making. An enthusiasm with life in the making is a shaping of the resonant field of experience in the withness of expressibilities taking form. This shaping is not a closed shape, does not take after an object or come from a subject. For it is not the human as preconstituted who is enthusiastic. Enthusiasm is the name I am giving to the tremulous field of expression itself, to its exuberance, especially when this field percolates at the very limits of expressibility in the before of the subject or object, in the before of image or form. Enthusiasm as a movement with that colors expressibility, giving a certain allure to the coming to expression. I is not enthusiastic. The shape of worlding is enthusiastic, informing toward an act without predecessor, an act always yet in the trembling, where memory echoes from the future. Enthusiasm touches on a future pastness, in a topology of time that does not sequester the beginning from the end, that captures the saying in its middling. In the middling, bodies are not yet constituted. Eventually, they will resolve, taking the form of 1,000 different species, with 1,000 different agencies. But let's not move too quickly toward a body reborn, for this is not where enthusiasm resonates. Let's stay instead in the in-between, in the force of form that shapes experience. For when we learn to dwell in the shaping of enthusiasm, that is the middling of experience, we discover many things, not least of which is that the difference between Auti-speak and any-speak is not as fundamental as we may have believed, despite what Frances Tustin says. From the perspective of her long-standing clinical research into autism, Frances Tustin writes of her many encounters with autistic shapes, which she describes as the non-object-oriented realm of preconscious experience where autistics linger. She does this critically, arguing that this process of shaping is something to be avoided. Rather than seeing the fascinating concept of pre-linguistic shapes as an inroad into understanding the complexity of experience, autistic or otherwise, Tustin prefers to confine the concept of shapes to the realm of the pathological, making it the goal of the psychoanalytic process she condones to divest autistics of their shapes. In so doing, she believes they will become more accountable to the objects in their midst. Tustin writes, In the days when I was working as a psychoanalyst child therapist with young autistic children, as they began to talk, they would tell me about their shapes. They were not the shapes of any particular object, just shapes. I do not know what other forms were covered by what they referred to as shapes. It was not the shape of a specific object which existed in actuality, it was just a shape. That Tustin cannot quite articulate the nature of a shape is not surprising. The shaping of experience in the making is dynamic and amodal, active in the perceptual field where language is not yet. It is, as described in the paper that I'm suggesting to read for tomorrow, Toward a Leaky Sense of Self, a vitality form, in Daniel Stern's terms, a preconscious verging toward a coming to act that tunes to the relational milieu of experience. Such a vitality form occurs in the half-second or less of an event's coming to expression. It is, as Stern underlines, quote, a manifestation of being alive that is all about movement. Vitality forms shape the lived experience of duration, giving incipient experience its activation contour. Giving this activity of shaping the name of enthusiasm, making enthusiasm the force of the not yet, emphasizes the towardness, the exuberance and the intensity of vitality forms, calling forth the way in which they manifest always in excess of actual form, in the towardness of a coming to be. Vitality forms take the shape of the not yet such that they inform not simply the content of the experience, but its affective tonality. Quote, they are the felt experience of force in movement with a temporal contour and a sense of aliveness of going somewhere, Daniel Stern. They are the, quote, shapes of sound, smell, taste, and sight that are, quote, felt rather than heard, smelled, tasted, or seen. This is Tustin. Quote, we are already reacting to a stimulus before we know what it is, writes Stern. Think the shape of enthusiasm as the associated milieu of experience where the relational field is still informing. Remember, the associated milieu is not an external environment, nor is it a neutral between of two actualized forms. The associated milieu is the witness of every coming to expression. It is always with its associated milieu that a given occasion of experience begins to take shape. Enthusiasm is of the milieu, not an external qualifier. Enthusiasm is the force of a resonant intensity that continuously reorients the field toward the more than of its potential. This reorientation is indeed, quote, already reacting to a stimulus, as Stern writes, but not through the specter of the, quote, we. It is not we who are reacting, for we are not yet co-constitutive worlding. The shape of enthusiasm is emphatically not a quantification of experience. Enthusiasm is not a moral category, not good or evil, just as the more than is not a quantification of life. Enthusiasm is what moves the field of experience toward the creativity of its continual recomposition. It is the insistent refrain that keeps coming back. Was that life? Well then, once more. Nietzsche. The shaping of the more than creates speciations. These speciations are hybrids, not human, not environmental, not animal. They emerge across forces of life living through the contour of the experiential matrix that is this or that coming to act. Speciation never begins on the macro scale. It binds the organic and the inorganic in an infinity of micro-perceptible ways, creating new forms of life living barely categorizable as form or matter. The core of the problem in Tustin's analysis of shapes is that she begins with species instead of speciations. To begin with species is to already have put into place a hierarchy of forms. The hierarchy itself then becomes a pathology, an enclosure that wrests from its protected environment all that does not resemble it, as separating, as Felix Guattari would say, the normopaths from the neurotics and psychopaths, and of course, the autistics. For pathologization takes the fully formed individual as a starting point to experience, and erects it as a norm. Yet, because there is no such thing as a stable individual, because the individual is always only a temporary vectorization of the larger process of individuation, more and more systems must be put into place to keep up the pretense of the stability of this imposed notion of the norm. These efforts include identifying certain traits within the human species and attempting to link them superficially with every individual in the category, in the case of autism, think mind blindness, thus creating a precise assemblage of normative behavior consistently reinforceable. Anything that does not immediately conform to the superficial content of what has been defined as the norm now falls into the more unstable field of the pathological, the sick, the other, the less than human, which in effect creates not only a paradoxical pathologization of the individual as such, who never really existed in any stable or reiterable way in the first place, but the more widespread pathologization of experience itself. The pathologization of experience then works to subtract from experience the ineffable more than, for there is no place for the more than in an ideology of rationalization or progress or survival or cure, whatever the leading byline. This not only disqualifies all that does not resemble it, it wrests experience of its incipiency, violently seeking to undermine the complexity of life living's processual shaping. Tustin's analysis of autistic shapes feeds into this very tendency, using the psychoanalytic language-oriented byline of her era. It was the 80s, mostly, when she was writing. The human individual is the norm, and to be human is to be in language in a specific way. It is to be capable of symbolizing the processual, a stabilizing experience. The autistic who lingers in the shape of enthusiasm must therefore be divested of her attachment to the processual, must be taught to speak, and more specifically, must be taught to articulate the content of experience in terms of already formed subjects and objects. We live in a world dominated by words and the shapes of actual objects, Tustin explains to justify her claim that it is counter to the autistic's well-being to dwell in the process of shaping. The ineffable, the unspeakable, must be avoided at all costs, for there is no future, no capacity for survival in the language we speak. Tustin is adamant, quote, autistic shapes are not merely psychological curiosities, they are blocks to more normal functioning. This is why Tustin must so quickly move toward the curing of autistics of their shapes. For while Tustin agrees that there is likely a, quote, normal, quote, inbuilt disposition to form shapes, she is adamant that ultimately there is no place in the normopathic world for the ineffable in act of shaping. And yet, as Stern demonstrates with the concept of vitality forms, all experience is informing. It is replete with the lulling, spinning, and vague formations of sensation Tustin describes, and these were her words. Shapes are everywhere active, and despite what Tustin says, the process of shaping is not predominantly autistic. The only reason to foreground the autistic here would be to underscore the way that autistics seem to be capable of lingering in the shaping, capable of slowing down the process of shifting to content. As autistic Rogue Edward writes, never think I'm not paying attention when I'm not looking, because I'm always paying complete attention to everything. I just can't begin to say how much you miss when you make your attention narrow and focused. It is the bane of autism to be able to attend to way too much. Communication is everywhere amplified by the more than of its apparent content. The shape of words, their affective tonality, the way they taste, what they provoke, how they appear, what lines of drift they trace, is as intensely foregrounded for autistics as the what of language's content. This is something Tustin cannot understand. They listen to other people's voices, not as a communication, but as a self-envelopment by lulling shapes, Tustin writes dismissively. She is clearly missing the point. She cannot fathom that the direct experience of lulling shapes means being capable of seeing the dance of attention of a world in taking form, of seeing the shape of enthusiasm in the communicating, a composing with. The shape of enthusiasm carries with it an intuition. Bergson calls intuition a, quote, direct vision, a, quote, vision which is scarcely distinguishable from the object seen, a knowledge which is contact, an event, coincidence. In the event, in the language we speak, between and in excess of words, there is an intuition of a coming to content that is more than the form of its communicability. This vision, as Bergson might call it, is a direct experience of dynamic form. A swelling, a surging, a bursting, an accelerating, a fading, a fleeting, a moving with. This dynamic form in the event's unfolding has, in Stern's words, no pre-imposed modality and is not a direct cognition. It is a direct vision of experience in the making, an intuited, immediate feltness of the how of experience. What Tustin cannot fathom is that this how of experience is in itself a form of composing with. It is an enthusiasm shared not simply with the human interlocutor, but with the world itself in the shaping. enthusiasm in the field of relation, a durational thinking feeling co-composing with movement worlding. In Bergson's words, intuition bound up to a duration which is growth, perceives in it an uninterrupted continuity of unforeseeable novelty. This is the language we speak, we who can float outside of time. In this ineffability of expression, in the intuition of duration itself, what of words? Where every word has weight and no thought is ever lost, this is the language we speak. Are vitality forms always in excess of words, in the before of articulation? Can there be a shaping of language informing, a listening with, between the words, a shape of enthusiasm in the saying, in the writing? This is a question Tustin never thinks to ask. In 1967, Fernand Deligny, this is his work, takes on a project of living with autistics in order to explore the potential of a different notion of care not encountered within the institutions that seek to organize experience and pathologize those who cannot speak the dominant language. If you're not familiar with Fernand Deligny, he worked at Laborde with Felix Guattari and was the editor of Recherche, so the journal that came out of Laborde in 65, 66, he was the editor. And although Guattari mostly writes about psychotics and schizophrenics, there was a certain there were a certain number of autistics within the population of Laborde in that period. You have to think as well that in the 60s, the mantle schizophrenia was given very broadly. So many people with schizophrenia were actually autistic. Now all the schizophrenics are called autistic. But in any case, so Deligny was at Laborde in that period and worked in particular with one of the patients, or one of the inhabitants of Laborde, Jean-Marie. But Deligny was even more anti-institutional than Guattari and felt that had enormous disagreements with the people at Laborde because they still kept files on the people who lived there and felt that this was still too hierarchical a process, and so left Laborde. And for some reason that I haven't been able to quite figure out, Guattari had a castle in Monoblet, and it was a very dilapidated castle. He gave it to Deligny to go and create a kind of militant organization in Monoblet. Anyway, this is the story. Deligny stayed for 30 years there and did extraordinary work for 30 years with autistics. And the main thing that Deligny did was to work with the institutions. You may not be surprised by this, it's so French, but for 8 weeks of the year, every year, the French go on holidays, and the patients in institutions are sent away from the institutions. And so if you have a family, you can go back to your family's house, that's good, but there are plenty of people within the institutions who have nowhere to go. And so the patients, or the people that worked with Deligny, started out as being people who were cast aside for those 8-week periods every year. In 1967, Fernand Deligny takes on a project of living with autistics in order to explore the potential of a different notion of care not encountered within the institutions that seek to organize experience and pathologize those who cannot speak the dominant language. Over a period of more than 2 decades, the dominant language is psychoanalysis, by the way, in this particular period in France, and it's just now changing where autism is concerned in ways that are very terrifying to me, but we can talk about that later. Deligny leads a network of encampments in the Cévennes at Monoblet, where autistic children are paired with local people assisted by interns. The idea was to welcome children between the ages of 3 and 10 who were mute, out of language, hors parole, as Deligny calls it. The cost was very low, and the stays could last between 3 or 4 months, 3 or 4 times a year. In an effort to conceive of a living networking of difference, Deligny turns his back on the psychiatric institution, and especially on psychoanalysis' tendency to pathologize the language we speak. He proposes instead a cartography of everyday life that occurs in a mode of cohabitation where the vectors of necessity, the sharing of a site, reorient the question of the normal and pathological toward notions of dynamic mappings that affect experience at the level of movement itself. The project is not to make autistics more like us, to make them speak or act within the communicational matrix of societal expectation. It is rather to create a dynamic milieu in the everyday context that can make felt the force of pre-articulation that lingers in the unsaid. This, he believes, will allow us to ask the question Tustin never addresses, the question of the between of words. This is a term from Amanda Baggs. She talks about beneath the words and between the words. She's an autistic who has quite a strong influence on my work, thus reorienting what it means to speak in the first person singular. Over the years, building on this explicit mandate to invent modes of relation that do not necessarily rely on words, a singular iteration of experience in the making begins to take the form of maps of movement, tracings, as Deligny calls them. These tracings, a collaboration between the network and the autistics, become incipient cartographies of an associated milieu of relation that builds on the way movement and life-living interrelate. The challenge, as Deligny conceived it, was to learn to, quote, to see language from the point of view of a mute child, a choreographic proposition. Together, farmer and child, intern and child, writer and child, filmmaker and child, militant and child, share a life that is parsed in hundreds of ways by the necessity of the everyday, the washing of clothing, the leading of goats, the building of encampments. From these daily tasks, tracings on paper emerge that outline the shiftings between sites and the reorientings of territories in the moving, tracings that magnify the moreness of habitual pathways. These tracings at once trace the regularity of habit and routine and the unrepresentable of its drifts. They do not reproduce movement, they activate it. In the aligning to the simple togetherness of the everyday, an everyday that moves in certain directions out of necessity and lifelong habits, and in other directions out of curiosity and drift, the tracings surreptitiously go far beyond the paths they trace to make felt the vitality forms of the comings to act that erupt across the territory's more stable lines, explosions of congruence, intensive contours. Through the shape of enthusiasm felt in the lines of drift, in the contours that reform the edges of space-time, an intuition is drawn. This is the intuition of a commoning that is beyond commonality, a commoning of lines of drift meeting, of lines lingering, thickening, curving, in a reorienting of space-times, of experience in the making. The tracings begin as a kind of intervention. In 1969, Jacques Lay, longtime collaborator of Deligny's in the network, is overtaken by an overwhelming feeling of disempowerment in the face of what he perceives as an uncontainable violence brought on by an autistic tantrum, no doubt in large part caused by the potent mixture of a lack of inhibition and oversensory stimulation. He is at a loss and turns to Deligny for assistance. Instead of trying to sort out the experience with language, Deligny suggests that Lay transcribe the autistic's movements, their displacements, in order to, quote, channel language through gesture in the tracing. In time, these tracings become a practice and a project across the network, quote, and so we must trace, not so that there be a trace, to keep something or to locate on the lines of space and experience. We must trace a trace before there is even a trace. We must trace these maps, give being to this drift, to this line that has nothing more than its own path, than the force of being there without a place of existence. Deligny. Deligny's project can be seen as one of co-composition through a common tracing that allows the uncommon to emerge. Deligny underscores, it is a lost cause to attempt to reform others to our image. What is important is to learn techniques of listening with, techniques which allow us to move with in a continuance of drift that opens the space-time of experience to the richness of its vitality forms, perhaps allowing the felt intensity of its shaping to stretch in duration, as it seems to do for autistics. And if, Deligny asks, instead of teaching them to speak, we learned to hold our tongues? The way the tracings emerged was over tracing paper. So what would happen is that you see in the tracings that there are these congruences. Anybody who's been around an autistic know that there can be these circular movements that are very habitual for autistics that are done to manage their nervous systems, the sensory overload. And so when, for example, Jean-Marie, who worked with Deligny a lot, would be asked, how were your movements during the day? Often Jean-Marie would trace them in circles. And what would happen is that Deligny would trace with him. And this would be done on tracing paper over tracing paper over tracing paper over tracing. So what you're seeing here are palimpsests of these tracings. The muteness of autism touches on the ineffable inexpressibility. It is more than a silence, more than a not speaking. It is the language we speak. To be silent is not to stop talking, se taire. It is not a reaction, it is a posture, an attitude, a style of life, an ensemble of gestures that hold speech in abeyance, and qui rien. Deligny is suspicious of language. For Deligny, language is tied too closely to the institutionalization of the other. Language is too content to categorize, organize, close down, too intent on subsuming intensity to content. Language is the matrix of representation, the structure of our world and the root of this specific belief that we need a me in order to exist, Deligny. But is there not another way of conceiving language? As Auti-type demonstrates, in the force of expressibility, where the shape of enthusiasm lingers in the language we speak, lives a certain muteness that is the pre-articulation of language informing. I should just say here that in Relationscapes I developed for quite a number of pages the idea of pre-acceleration, which is a sort of an intensity of moving which happens before the displacement happens, that is experienced all the time, that a movement comes from a kind of intensity that exists within it. In pre-articulation, I'm trying to define in a very similar way within language. So I'm not talking about the before of language so much as the with of language that is not non-linguistic or not exactly pre-linguistic, sort of with linguistic. And so you could think of it as rhythm, for example, or you could think of it as even gesture. Pre-articulation's activation contour is the how of language's movement with, that shapes not necessarily words as such, but the force of their incipient expressibility. Language, Auti-type demonstrates, can also be active in lines of drift that move in a worlding that persists between the words. I suppose it's maybe obvious, but the first poem I read was by an autistic. Perhaps that's not obvious, but it just occurred to me that might not be clear. Poetry has long done this, exposing language to the more than of its content, activating the incipient expressibility within expression. Jim Sinclair's poem leads the way here, reminding us that poetry can be a voice for the language we speak, that poetry's techniques of rhythm and repetition give us a taste of what lurks between the words and across the lines. Deligny also has an intuition that takes him in this direction, for he makes a place for his own poetic voice to be heard beside, between the tracings. The first image I showed where you had Jean-Marie's tracings and then Deligny's writing around them, activating the traces with words written in a rhythm that co-composes with the drifting lines. This opens writing itself to a drift that reorients the territory, that composes across the we of this is the language we speak, and we the normopaths. For Deligny's is a composing with, where the we is continuously replaced by the more than of the iteration, the not quite sayable of its ineffability, where we are not yet. If a we does emerge, it is an uncommon we, in the sense of Michael's concept of the commons. The we of which I speak is the inverse of a we too. But it is not a myth and resides discreetly with all the forms of a we here, a we there. To respect it requires no doubt a certain rigor for which I would be incapable of formulating rules. Deligny. We here is a multiple, always more than the expressibility of its taking form. For the we in the tracings, in the language we speak, is a field continuously co-constituted by the events it calls forth. It never knows what to say in advance of the saying. The we is adrift. Quote, tracing maps is first to try to not speak, to not want to know. It is to accept that there is more than the human, that there exists a human who is nothing of ourselves, and yet is nonetheless there without knowing who he is, who is there close by without anything to do, de Ligny. They drift, quote, again, de Ligny, to try to see from the other side of we, to no longer enclose and to stop thinking in the mode of I. I is but a truncated metaphor for de Ligny, the source of all their delusions and missed encounters, a substantive forged by the history of discourse, a stranglehold of grammar. That's Beatrice Hahn. This is our home beyond nowhere, where shadows' footsteps fall, where memory echoes from the future, and comfort flows back from the past, where smiles have no need for faces. The smile that needs no face is a becoming without an eye, a life living in the speciation. The smile that needs no face precedes being. It shapes not being as such, but the force of a becoming that is not yet. This force of becoming is a phasing toward a vectoring. From the amorphous shape of enthusiasm, it is a tweaking toward a taking form that enacts. This enacting is already a hybrid, its speciation agglomerating across tendencies rather than fixed form. The smile that needs no face lulls in the betweenness of a saying. It dances in the territory of its making. The force of its more than is always in excess of a given species. Each tracing is a speciation. It draws not an image so much as a choreographic proposition for a new kind of attuning, a new kind of mapping of experience. These mappings of experience are procedures not for the representation of a movement already lived. They are the activation for life living of a process of shaping. This shaping takes the shape of enthusiasm when it truly proposes a new mode of existence. This is Beatrice Hahn. Against all pedagogical methods, all institutional and coercive forms, de Ligny develops a mode of common living that consists of tracing, that blossoms in a living with, and that consists of lines of drift that burrow one of the trajectories, fugitive, gracile, reedy as a thread without a net. For there is nothing to say, there is nothing to do, only to exist and trace again. Tracings, layer upon layer, superimposed on tracing paper, harbingers, as de Ligny refers to them, of, quote, an immediate enthusiasm that touches us without our knowing why, a touching that occurs not through the effects of language, but beyond, where something that cannot be seen exists, something ineffable, but nonetheless, in de Ligny's words, immediately felt. For tracings make apparent the briefest of felt intervals. De Ligny writes, to maintain the interstices, this should be the work of these maps we are tracing. And continues, the maps stop there, at the threshold of the encounter, at the limit of the void and the unbearable, at the confluence of the living and the undecidable. At this briefest interval, at the threshold of a different kind of togetherness, the tracings define a modality of orientation that exceeds or defies Euclidean maps. For their orienting is a shaping in the encounter. It does not direct or foreshadow, it draws out a confluence. This confluence activates new tendencies, new orientations in the living. These new orientations occur, quote, at the limit of the void and the unbearable, a limit that tells us nothing. There is nothing to say, but speaks instead between the words at the confluence of the living and the undecidable. Those were all de Ligny's words. Lines of drift, a tracing that activates an encounter with an orientation that maps times spiral. If you know Guattari's work, you'll recognize lines of drift from A Thousand Plateaus, but Brian translated it as something else.
I think that's it.
That's what you did? Yeah, there's a lot of discussion right now about
Wanderlands.
wander lines or lines of drift. I think I chose lines of drift because that's how it's been translated. The felt interval is an emergent attuning to forces in the moving. What can be felt here in the event's vitality form, a dynamic that, quote, in Stern words, is the event's vitality form, a dynamic that, quote, gives a temporal and intensity contour to the content. What is at stake here is not the content of the image, but the activity of the field the event gives rise to. In de Ligny's words, it is the difference between transcribing a sensation and tracing to permit something wholly other than the already felt to appear. The already felt is content pre-mapped onto experience. This does violence to experience, if for no other reason than in order to consistently reappear as the form of what was in the mode of the already felt, the content will have to be policed, held together, frozen, for no experience can truly be replayed quite the same way, twice. Content pre-mapped requires a suffocation of time, of process. It requires the pre-mapping onto experience of the no time of the will have known in advance. Pathologization happens in this no time of experience. In ordinary maps, in a cartography of precise Euclidean coordinates, the already defined masks lines of drift. Such maps draw conclusions in advance based on the autocracy of the similar, of the already seen, of the lived before. No trace of democracy in this enterprise, writes Deligny about his networking experiment. Quote, at the limit and in the best moments, the children's mode of listening is imperceptible. To formulate it is to put into danger this imperceptibility. Like a choreographer, Deligny's project in the Cévennes involves a crafting of conditions for the creation of an ontogenetic process of bodying that does not begin with existing form, but seeks to create speciations, new forms, forces of life living. This choreographic process occurs at a locus that is always itself being redefined. Not the place of the institution, but also not simply the place of the mountains, the place of the locals, the place of the autistics. The locality is itself reorienting. Note that Deligny focuses on encampments rather than on a more conventional notion of home or place. He leaves the castle. The locus of the encounter is both here and more than here, turning the very concept of place onto itself in an intensive reorienting of the associated milieu of relation. The encampments were sort of like tents, except that they were built often with wood, so that you would just have a kind of lean-to, and you would sleep in the lean-to, and you might stay there for a week or a month or an hour, I don't know, and then you'd build another encampment. And so it was always cooking outside and sleeping outside and so on. The goal, to make encounter into event, to create the conditions for the emergence of speciations that are made of variations on the milieu, to architect an environment that is potentializing not only for the autistic, but for the community as it reinvents itself, to create, as Blanchot might say, a community to come. Pathology is never far away. Speciations extrude species. Surely there was plenty of stratification, hierarchy, habit, no doubt. But what makes Deligny's choreographic proposition stand out is that he was interested not in fashioning a project that would define itself in the autistic once and for all, but like Félix Guattari and Jean-Henri with Laborde, to craft conditions that would allow for an attuning of emergent relations in order not so much to heal the autistic, than to activate the community toward a rethinking of the we. For Deligny was interested in how a choreographic proposition might create drifts that are continuously cutting through, despite and with the powers that be, continuously unraveling pathologies in the making. I should say here that Deligny died in the late 90s, but a lot of the autistics, or a number of the autistics, have continued to live there in the families or in the communities that they grew up in. And so there has been, the community was never given money to do this. It was always done on the basis of simply a desire. And the bonds formed within that wider community were so strong that forms of living were created. And one of the reasons, I'm having trouble getting the rights to Deligny's work, but one of the reasons that I want so much to translate this work is because we have very few examples in North America, or anywhere really, of adequate forms of living for adult autistics. And money runs out when they reach adulthood. And so this is a creative mode of living, which I think that the neurodiversity community and also all of the parents of autistics would appreciate knowing about. It is here, in the orienting toward a concept of life living, where the human is not yet, and more than, that Deligny worked to invent techniques for the proliferation of drifts that not only gave the autistics a voice, but also gave him a story to tell, a trace to follow. This is our home beyond nowhere, writes Jim Sinclair. Beyond nowhere, the more than of life living dwells in a shaping that continuously drifts. Beyond nowhere is a line that moves, not running from the world or running the world, but running with it, now here. Our home beyond nowhere is the language we speak. Now here is the milieu, the never known in advance. Here, speciations abound, forever getting overcoded by species, by the imposition of the no time of pathologization, by the segmentarity of rigid lines that mark off a territory, creating an inside and an outside. This will always happen. And yet speciations will also infinitely re-emerge. They are unstoppable. The technical question is how to draw out the durational intensity of the drift, how to forestall the lingering and experience that autistics describe so beautifully. The language of the drift, of shapes, is pathologized because the lingering seems hedonistic, because there are things to do, places to be. What happens when the tables are turned? What happens when we begin to realize that these places to be are themselves composed of infinite lines of drift, creating runoffs, orienting anew, again? For lines of drift are everywhere active. You can't start from the macro and build down. You can never fully count on the edifice you've built to protect you from the orientings in place of pure experience. The drift is ultimately unavoidable. The shape of enthusiasm is but one possible shape the drift can take. There are an infinity of ways of articulating the force of an intensive enjoyment that speciates across the organic and the inorganic, an infinity of ways to conceive of the confluence of life and experience. There is an infinite ecology of practices. The shape of enthusiasm is but one way to give a direct vision of the feltness of the exuberance of life living. It's unrestrained, infinitely multiplying orienting that is not a directionality, not an acting on, but an in-act, alive in the driftings of life livings coming to expression. The shape of enthusiasm lurks in and beyond language, across the lines of drift, between the words. Deligny suggests that this shaping creates a commoning, a common and emphatically beyond community and commonality, beyond communication as the making symbolic of life as language, beyond the social as the organization of the I. A common in the crossing, in the composing. Commons are active in the tracings, and tracings are ubiquitous. Guattari writes, individual or group, we are traversed by lines, meridians, geodesics, tropics, and zones marching to different beats and differing in nature. Tracings cut as much as they run off. They create no certainty, but they do delimit. Each line has its own modality, and with the drift, no doubt, come all kinds of rigid segmentarities, language being only one of them. Quote, supple segmentarity is only a kind of compromise operating by relative deterritorializations and permitting reterritorializations that cause blockages and reversions to the rigid line. Guattari. Limits are always already there, even within the lines of drift. They are the affordances that enable the tracings, thickenings of the brush, mountainings of the slope, affordances emergent on the paper as exuberances in their own right. Limits are also thresholds or even barriers, the end of a road, the wall that cannot be scaled. These create the stillings, the diversions, the segmentarity. The notion of the limit plays two ways within tracings, activating both the constraint that allows for the tracing in the first place. For there to have been a line, there had to have been a certain quality of movement, a certain opening within the territory, and the barrier through which the line must fold or break. There is never indifference at the limit. Everything matters. Think the limit as an activation contour onto which a certain tenor of movement moves. The limit not as that which delimits the common, but that through which a commoning becomes expressive. The limit as enabling constraint of a commonality in the making, a language unsaid but ripe for the moving. The common as becoming body, as more than, is not the result of a negotiation. The common is never there in advance of the field it proposes. It is a coming to expression of the associated milieu of life living. Here, in the milieu of life living, new forms of life emerge that are not beings so much as dynamic shapings of experience in the making, bursts and broken circles, hard lines and soft contours, agitated crossings and ludic darkenings of the field of experience in the moving. In Deligny's words, these maps, to tell the truth, do not say much, except that we in no way know what the human is, nor what the common.
Erin, thanks so much for that. We do have some time for questions, so.
I was just wondering if you could say anything about if there's any relationship between the tracing and memory. I know that this is a getting beyond the individual but could there be a desire to return to a specific tracing, to rediscover it as something, somewhere you've already been?
That's a good question. I think that definitely in the Bergsonian definition of memory that would make sense, where memory is always the activation rather than a receptacle. So in a non-psychoanalytic understanding of memory, I suspect that Deligny would have been sort of extreme in his not wanting memory to play out. He was pretty extreme in all senses, I think, from what I can tell. But, and so the tracings were actually not used in that way. In fact, they weren't used at all. They were sort of pragmatic ways of having a conversation, really. So they were used as a mechanism to sideline the tantrums that were so much caused by the anxiety of not being able to express, right? And so they were really a form of communication in that regard. But I see where you're coming from. Yeah, I suspect that any act of tracing holds within it the agitations of a kind of emergent memory.
I'm curious about, or I'd like to hear more about enthusiasm. And I'm not quite exactly sure what, it feels like you have that there's more to it than I've understood yet, but maybe that's what I mean. Is enthusiasm intensification? And then the shape of enthusiasm I still haven't gotten yet, but still first enthusiasm, I'm not sure what.
Yeah, you know, I'm still not quite there too. Somebody wrote me, this came up as maybe the way that so much of our writing comes, where somebody writes to me and says, I really would like a paper from you on enthusiasm. And you think, okay, let's see what I can think about enthusiasm. And it actually began with an image, and this was Ralph's son DJ, who's autistic, who's really a big part of this book. I was at his 18th birthday, and this was a moment with a lot of intensity. The whole family was there, and if you've never seen this, it's hard to imagine the extraordinary, intense expression of enthusiasm that is autistic. I mean, I don't know how to express it otherwise than to say that it is something that is so unbridled.
Eight drunk people on a trampoline gets close to one.
Right. Yeah, it's extraordinary. But what is so strong about it to me is that it isn't positive necessarily. So it's full of anxiety and full of unsayabilities. You know, DJ can't speak, so he types, but he's not always in a situation where typing is facilitated. So there's a lot of this, really, like the enthusiasm is everywhere in every part of his body. And so watching DJ and having a sense that there is a way in which, I mean, I think, Ralph, you said this at the party, imagine if we didn't hold back. Imagine if everything that happened was so visible. And so having that image in mind, you know, I was reading Tustin, and enthusiasm is a word that Deligny uses. And Tustin is, you know, she brings up this concept of autistic shapes. So I'm taking these two words from them, you know, and thinking, well, you know, and I should say really wanting in this book to really challenge the idea of autism being something we have to feel sorry about.